Welcome to Under One Roof, the podcast exploring the intersection of housing and health. I'm your host, Dr Tom Simcock. Now, if you're tuning in for the first time, let me give you a quick recap. This podcast is for anyone who's ever wondered how the place we call home can shape our physical and mental health. Housing is often thought of as just a roof over our heads. Our homes affect our lives in many different ways, from how we interact with our space, the air quality and building materials, to the broader neighbourhoods and policy systems. And this is why we've created this podcast, to delve into thought-provoking discussions, uncover the latest research, and speak to experts who shed light on the crucial intersection of housing and health. Today we have an excellent guest with us, Dr Craig Gurney from the University of Glasgow. Craig is a leading researcher in the field of housing. His work has explored the meaning of home, the social construction of housing tenure, and social harm and housing. His work on the concept of home as a place of harm has provided valuable insights into the complex relationship between our living environment and our well-being. I'm truly excited to have Craig join us today. His expertise and passion for the subject will undoubtedly enrich our understanding of the challenges individuals face within their own homes. So whether you're a policymaker, an academic, a housing professional, a health practitioner, or simply someone with a keen interest in the intricate dynamics of our living spaces, this episode is for you. Get ready for a thought-provoking conversation that will challenge our perceptions and inspire us to create healthier homes for all. Hello, Craig, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Tom, and thanks very much indeed for the invitation to contribute to the podcast. Very exciting times. Thank you.
Craig, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Before we dive into our discussion on home as a place of harm, could you please take a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, well, so my name's Craig Gurney. I'm, as you said, I'm a lecturer in housing studies at the University of Glasgow. I've been at Glasgow now since January 2020. Prior to that, I was a housing academic at the University of Cardiff, and prior to that at Sheffield Hallam University. So I started teaching on housing courses in 1991, probably before many of your listeners were even born. So that makes me feel very old, and indeed I am chronologically. My first degree was in urban studies in the 80s. I did an MSc in urban and regional studies, and my PhD was at the University of Bristol, and I completed my PhD thesis in the early 1990s, and that was about the meaning of home and the meaning of home ownership, and I'm still interested in those things now. So as well as kind of teaching and doing research at Glasgow, I'm also the program director for the MSc Housing Studies program at Glasgow, which is really enjoyable. I'm very proud of that role. I'm also involved as the pathway lead for social work and social policy in the SGSSS, which is the Scottish Graduate School of Social Sciences. Essentially what we do is we're the people involved with allocating ESRC funding for potential PhD applicants across Scotland. And I've also recently been appointed to the management board of the Child Institute Housing Scotland, which is important, I think, for an academic to make a contribution to practice. So previously, when I worked in Wales, I was the chair of Cynnon Community Housing Group. So I think it's really important, particularly when your work is quite a theoretical bent, as it were, to maintain that kind of foothold in practice. So so that's me.
Thank you, Craig. A very distinguished and varied career, and I think it's clear that you have a deep passion for this topic, but also housing education more broadly. You mentioned the meaning of home as your PhD thesis. As a topic, it has come back to the fore, and it's very pertinent today, especially with debates in the private renting sector about renters being able to make their sort of rented property a home. What drove your interest in exploring, that meaning of home?
I can actually vividly remember the instant that I had the idea for my PhD thesis. and I was having a shower in my flat in Brighton at the time. But you don't want to know that; that's too much information already. But I think it at the time, and this we're talking about the late or the mid to the mid to the late 1980s, debates about housing tenure in the UK were really important. You've got to remember the context of what were the social and cultural implications and consequences of the 1980 Housing Act, the right to buy. We know, your listeners will know all about residualisation, and your listeners will know all about the long-term consequences of the right to buy policy. So as an undergraduate student, and then as a master's student, and then as a PhD student, I was always really interested in, well, what did that mean? What did that 10-year transformation mean? And I was particularly influenced by the work at the time of Peter Saunders, who actually supervised my master's dissertation at Sussex when I was a student at Sussex, and took issue with his argument that there was a 10-year specific meaning of home. He famously argued in his Three Towns survey, published in the 1990 book A Nation of Homeowners, that the meaning of home was 10-year specific, displayed very little variation in terms of region or ethnicity, but was gender neutral. So my thesis was essentially taking issue with the 10-year specificity and the gender neutrality of the meaning of home. I argued that the cisgender men and women respondents in my research, in my survey, experienced home very differently, and that tenure in itself wasn't the most important thing about determining the meaning of home. Yes, homeowners might well feel differently about their home to tenants, but there's nothing innate in the tenure itself that drives those feelings. And indeed, more recently, there's lots of research which suggests that there are lots of things that you can do in the social rented sector and the private rented sector, and indeed, Tom, your own work kind of speaks to that, which can give tenants those kind of feelings of niche and belonging that we associate with ontological security. It's another buzzword. That we traditionally would have associated with ownership tenures, but actually it's not owning or renting per se that drove that. It was the experiences and the social practices of living in those tenures. So yeah, and as you said, debates kind of go around and come around and become fashionable again, if they ever were fashionable. But it certainly is the case that more folk are now interested in the meaning of home than they have been for a very long time. If you go onto Scopus or Web of Science, you see there's been a real resurgence of interest in that, and I guess that's to do with the fact that the tenure change is rife again, and that we've seen a growth in the private rented sector. We've seen that the social rented sector is starting to grow again. We've seen that home ownership is in decline. We know about all the affordability crises. We know now about all the crises about regulation and safety. And we have lots of data in housing, but a lot of that data, of course, is organised by tenure. So I think that it's very, and I'm not at all being critical of people who do research in this field, but I mean, the data is there. And we can make those associations between housing tenure and people's experience of their housing, and inevitably we end up thinking about home, particularly kind of post-COVID. We know there was a massive natural experiment there about what home was going to mean to people when we all had to stay there, so I think that. Yeah, for lots of reasons. There's been some really interesting recent publications about the meaning of home, but for lots of reasons, it's kind of back on the radar again. So I feel as if, it's kind of, hold my beer, hold my pint. And it's nice to be able to talk about stuff that I'm passionate about again and have people listen. So that's nice.
And over the last few years, especially around COVID-19, your work on the meaning of home has evolved, looking into home as a place of harm. Would you be able to just talk to us about how that sort of area of work came about?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons why that kind of happened, really. I mean, obviously, as we mentioned before, that COVID-19 was a massive natural experiment in terms of thinking about what home means to people. Alfred Schutz wrote a really famous paper in the American Journal of Sociology in 1944 called The Homecoming. And he talked about how returning servicemen, not servicemen, but servicemen returning from the front in the Second World War in America would feel differently about their home as a result of their experiences away from home and those very violent experiences. And kind of iconic paper in terms of thinking about what home means, and it's often cited. And I guess really for me, COVID-19, these lockdowns, this legislation being passed to make people stay at home, was this huge natural experiment. Becky Tunstall's recent book, just called Stay Home, kind of encapsulates those feelings, and I think it's important to remind ourselves what that felt like. I mean, we were all gathered around television screens all around the world, waiting for our leaders to tell us when and for how long and for what reasons we had to stay at home. And I think so that was always going to be an interesting time. So that certainly drove it. But I think that for a long time, I felt kind of dissatisfied with the dominant narratives of home always being a place of safety, always being a place of security, always being a place of refuge and a place of security and expression. Because it hadn't always felt like that for me. And I think that the more the more my life kind of developed and my career developed, I felt that there was a stronger kind of degree of dissonance with what the literature was saying, so I don't want to go, this isn't the place for me here to talk about my struggles with mental health and my relationship breakdowns and my experience of coercive control or my experience of depression, although it's relevant. So I found that that how I felt about the home and my own home bore no resemblance at all to the dominant narratives in literature about this place being a supportive, protective place. That was also kind of brought home to bear when my father died 5 years ago now. He would have loved to listen to this. He would have thought, Craig's made it. Someone's recorded what he's talking about. And he died as a result of his retirement hobby, which was drinking. And the majority of that drinking took place in the home environment. So again, it's this idea that there's all these dangerous things which occur in the home. There's all these harms which occur in the home. So for many people, it was far from a safe space. So I think there's four specific sorts of harms which I think occur at home. I mean, the first one is the experience of coercive control, intimate partner violence, domestic violence. Okay, so there's that type of physical and emotional harm. Secondly, there's the mental health harms associated with loneliness, isolation, depression, suicidal ideation and act. Most suicide deaths occur within the home environment globally. Thirdly, and I mentioned this in relation to my experience of my father's death, health harming behaviors, the so-called the big killers, the non-communicable diseases. Okay, so all the things we know we shouldn't be doing. Okay, so it's excessive consumption of alcohol, drug use, eating unhealthily, not exercising, all the things that we do within the home environment, perhaps because we wouldn't be able to do them quite so freely in a public space or a place exposed to scrutiny, precisely because they are taking place in a private sphere. They constitute a particular form of harm that we perhaps wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. And finally, of course, the fourth type of harm are the material risks, the so-called unintentional injuries. I mean, like, the medical profession doesn't call them by the word accident anymore. The word accident doesn't exist because these are, you can predict accidents. You can predict when they're going to happen. It's the most frail, the most vulnerable, the very, very old, the very, very young, who have unintentional injuries at home. So trip hazards, poisonings, falls, but also, of course, the exposure to damp, to cold, and to mold. And I think what's most important, and we should remember his name, the most important about the death of Al Abishak in Rochdale a couple of years ago was the fact that the coroner, Joanne Kersey, the senior coroner for North Manchester, put her head above the parapet and said, look, this is a defining moment, that this child died as a result of exposure to damp and mold within the dwelling. And I think we all know, listening, that there were countless other children and adults who may have died as a direct result of that. But we all know, when we're looking at the relationship between health and housing, it's very difficult to demonstrate causation because there's always other things that are going on. Yeah, there are always confounding variables. So I think that Joanne Kersey's comment that in the summing up of the, in that coroner's report, that this child died as a result of exposure to these the physical material conditions of the dwelling is really, really important. And I think that the names Joanne Kersey and Al Abishak should be remembered for those reasons. So so far from being a safe, secure, warm and fuzzy, cuddly place, actually we all know that home is far from that. So that's my story about thinking about home as a dark side.
One of the key concepts that you use in your work is around social harm. How do you think you can use these sort of terms and concepts to examine the relationship between housing and health in the framing and development of public policy?
Right, big question. I've got lots to say. Do you want the 7-inch radio version or the 12-inch megamix? Because I could talk for an hour. You want the short version. You don't need to answer. Right. Social harm is a concept which has emerged from critical criminology in the last 15 to 20 years. The authors are people like Hilliard, Toms, Pemberton, Ricky Canning as well. Quite a big literature on social harm now. Also this linked term of zemiology, 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 which is the study of harms. Social harms can be defined in various different ways. It's a classic academic contested subject. We academic bingo, we have these contested terms, but essentially it's about anything which compromises human flourishing or prevents human needs from being fulfilled. It's the kind of classic quote from Pemberton. You can think of physical harms, obviously deaths we can think about. We can think about inequalities in life expectancy. So that links back to the kind of the famous Marmot reviews, the influential Marmot reviews of 2010 and 2020. There's physical harms, emotional and psychological harms, autonomy harms, recognition harms, financial harms, cultural harms. But of course, the issue is that some of these harms are more difficult or easier to measure than others. We routinely, as nation states, collect data on life expectancy and on death rates and infant mortality, deaths by suicide. Some of these things are easier to measure than others, and they're more kind of codified. So I think when we talk about social harms, we very often focus on but the nature of it, and we focus on things which are often deaths of despair and things which aren't comfortable to talk about. But the point about studying social harms is recognizing the fact that there are things which occur to people which may not be the result of illegal activities or criminal activities, but they nevertheless experience harms as a result of it. The implication being that some crime, some illegal activity doesn't actually cause harm to anybody, and some things which aren't illegal can be massively harmful to people.
That sort of brings us on to another concept that you use regularly in your work around the term social murder. Would you just be able to explain to us a bit about where that sort of term and concept of social murder comes from?
Engels popularised the term social murder, working in Manchester in the 1840s. His book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, was published in 1845. It wasn't published in English until the 1890s, and even then only in the States. It was only published in the UK in English, I think in 1895 or 96, I think. But in that book, he talks about this term social murder, and he he picked up the term from working class activists, the Chartists and the Owenites, who used this term social murder, to explain the situation by which working class people were being hurried to their graves ahead of their time. It's the term that's often used, as a result of intolerable living and working conditions. Now, okay, you think this is, we know, in terms of our history, we know that people's living conditions 200 years ago were clearly considerably worse than what they are now. We get that. No one is suggesting that people are living in worse conditions than they were 200 years ago. However, the very fact that this term has been rediscovered and is being deployed by politicians, by journalists and academics, I think says something about current debates and narratives around housing, and in particular the relationship between housing and health. The very fact that we saw that there was a significant variation in patterns of COVID-19 deaths, the fact that we know as a result of the Mark reviews that those social determinants of health are so important, and they can have such a profound impact upon your life expectancy. There's two adjacent communities in Glasgow, either side of the River Clyde. Drummoyne Shield Hall, south of the River Clyde, and Hineland, Jordan Hill to the north of the River Clyde. If you access those going through the Clyde Tunnel and you're driving, it's 5 minutes, it's 2 miles. Walking, a little bit longer. The fall in life expectancy when you travel from the north to the south underneath the River Clyde in Glasgow is 20 years for men, 17 years for women. So the profound kind of inequalities, and those are, this is all tied up with the so-called social determinants of health. So the fact that this term social murder is being rediscovered, I think is really important. And of course, the obvious driver for that was the entirely preventable and avoidable deaths. And I use those terms preventable and avoidable because those were the words that were used in the Grenfell Tower inquiry when the inquiry concluded. Or the report, is yet to be published as I'm speaking to you. But those preventable and avoidable deaths were kind of seized upon as another example of 21st century social murder. So I think that the fact that we're talking about social murder, which is clearly a high valency term, and it's quite extreme. The word murder is an extreme. I understand that, but the fact that we're talking about that, and that we're talking increasingly about this idea of social harm, I think speaks to the recognition and the actuality of the fact that the people are thinking very carefully now about the relationship between housing quality, and health inequalities, and the role of housing in driving those health inequalities, which of course is why we're here on this podcast.
Yeah, and definitely. And I think, it's, as you said, really important to understand the valency of that language as well, in terms of the power behind that language as well that's being used, as you said, murder is quite an intense wording, isn't it?
I think just one thing I'd like to add in relation to that is that one of the things that this focus, this what I call elsewhere the violence term, as it were. I mean, academics talk about the term, the cultural term, the embodied term. The focus on the violence term, I think, makes us recognise that things like excess winter deaths, things like the social gradient in health, are not, and the things, excess winter deaths, that I mentioned before, but these things are not natural. They're not inevitable. It's not normal. And one of the things about epidemiology and the social harm perspective more generally is just recognizing the fact that capitalism is dangerous, and that one of the things that epidemiology is about is thinking about ways in which we can regulate to make the market safer and to make capitalism safer. And that's why I think that's another reason why these echoes back to Engels and Engels' work about the experience of the proletariat in the 1840s is so pertinent now. And also, of course, if you look at different welfare regimes, you see very striking differences in death rates, in infant mortality, suicide rates, road traffic accidents, obesity levels. And Simon Pemberton's book is full of that. So I would encourage people to read Pemberton's work. But Pemberton talks a lot about that, and has got all sorts of big data which demonstrates how different types of welfare regimes generate different levels of social harm. And I'll let your listeners speculate on which welfare regimes are most harmful. You can probably guess, actually, but that's just something else to say, is that the social harm focus makes us question things which we might otherwise take for granted as being natural or inevitable. There are plenty of countries that are much colder than the UK that have much lower levels of excess winter deaths. So it's not just about your temperature or your climate. There's other things going on.
I think that's a really good point, and something for us to consider as housing researchers. And thinking about the housing studies community, what would be your recommendations for future research based on your findings around, social harm, but also home as a place of harm?
I think that focus on regulation is really important. I think that historically, when we've thought about health and safety and things like that, it's not very sexy, is it? We often think about health and safety in relation to workplace harms. Yeah, we understand that it's just been involved in a fire drill. It's really important that people are kept safe at work. But actually, we probably spend more time. We do spend more time at home. So I think that housing researchers, with all due respect to those that have trodden this path before, I don't think I've certainly never taught much in relation to kind of health and safety. When we've looked about regulation, we've looked at it in a very superficial sense. So I think that firstly, a focus on regulation and making that connection between kind of architecture and engineering and fire safety and building control. I mean, housing studies, as traditionally experienced and taught and researched in the UK, tends not to engage much. And with all due respect, and I apologise if I'm misspeaking, and of course if I've neglected people's work, I do apologise. But as far as I can see, that engagement with kind of building regs and building technologies is fairly minimal, really. It's we could do much more. So I think firstly, a greater engagement with ideas about regulation and safety. And I think the work of people like Jenny Bruce recently in relation to the cladding scandal is really important in relation to that. I think also, though, just more work on thinking about home as a social practice, and thinking about what homes contain and what homes facilitate, and why that's important in terms of thinking about homelessness, but why that's also important in terms of reflecting upon the psychological harms that may occur at home. So your colleague Phil Brown, of course, with the locked down recent papers about being locked down, kind of captures that nicely in terms of the psychological consequences of the lockdowns and the psychological consequences of living in poorly maintained accommodation. And a recent paper by Clare and Baker in Social Science and Medicine talks about that as well. The fear of living in cold homes and the stresses that can cause. So I think those two things. I think a greater focus on regulation, a greater focus on what homes facilitate and contain. But I think finally, building on the regulation, a greater focus on professional skills within the sector, and that anybody involved in housing management and housing development needs to be properly professionally trained. Now, I've clearly got a dog in this fight because I'm the programme director of an MSc in housing course, so I appreciate that. But I think the housing ministry in England just recently called for the mandatory qualifications, and I think to the outside world, this is quite perturbing, because one would have assumed, wouldn't one? A layperson might have assumed that all housing professionals are suitably trained and highly skilled, and of course many of them are. But I think the fact that Al Abishak's death occurred would suggest that we, as a sector, we can all do better. So I think that's the third thing that's important, is that we focus on the upskilling of people who are working in housing. So all housing professionals, I think that's really important.
I think you've set a whole agenda for the housing studies community to look into, Craig, there, and a really interesting developments in the housing education space, especially with your micro credentials. Especially as you mentioned that Michael Gove has announced the mandatory qualifications for housing managers and executives. What are your thoughts on the introduction of mandatory education for housing managers?
The education's not a bad thing, is it? And that anything which encourages people to think critically in these troubling times of fake news and perhaps we could have another chat one day about the responses to the 20-minute neighbourhood. And I want to be put on record now as saying the 20-minute neighbourhood is a good thing. It's a benign concept at the heart of sustainable town planning and neighbourhood planning. And that I think that in the context of bizarre, frankly, utterly bizarre news stories like that, about people thinking that this is a really, really bad thing and we're going to be caged in cities. I think in that context, anything that promotes critical thinking and encouraging people to read and think critically has got to be a good thing. So yeah, I'm all for more education. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, and I suppose that it gives us that sort of impetus on why things like this podcast, but other forms of, science communication and the public engagement is so important, just getting those messages across. And I have one sort of final question for you, and it's, what are you currently working on? And, is there anything exciting that we can look forward to reading or hearing from you?
Well, I don't know about exciting, Tom. Obviously, I want to, keep my powder dry. No, okay, three things. I'm working on a book at the moment about housing, health, and social harm, and the title's going to have, various words in the title like that may or may not be in the same order. So firstly, this book on social harm. Secondly, on the kind of teaching and pedagogy side, I'm developing some micro credentials. So recently I put together a MOOC, a massive open online course on gentrification, and I'm with colleagues at Glasgow. I'm looking to develop avenues and opportunities for micro credentials in housing and homelessness. So micro credentials are kind of a bite-sized chunk of a bigger course, so you can accumulate your credits and cash them in, and that kind of speaks to the wider housing education agenda. So that's good. And the other thing I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to kind of conceptually think about fear and housing. So this is more of the kind of Gurney doom and gloom about thinking about home as a bad place. But it kind of struck me that particularly reading Clare and Baker's recent paper about the mental health harms of the cost of living crisis and cold homes in the UK in winter 2022-23. Of course, it's not the coldness itself. It's not the act of being cold generates mental poor health. It's fear, isn't it? It's fear. And you think about actually, whether going back to my point about social harms, you think about fear in relation to the fear of coercive control, the fear of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, the fear of developing arrears, the fear of losing your deposit, the fear of eviction, the fear of homelessness, the fear of the aggressive neighbour from hell, the fear of being ostracized by other neighbours, and there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff going on there. So I think I'm thinking about that, and that's all I'll say at the moment. I'm trying to write something about that, but I think there's something in there, and it seems to me that the next logical step in terms of, okay, we've established that home can be a harmful place. Then what are the consequences of that? And I think we can do things in terms of harm regulation. We can better regulate the sector. We can ensure that the building regs and fire regs are enforced, for example. We can do that. But as we know, we look at crime data. The fear of crime is much greater than the natural crime itself. Yeah, and I think the fear of housing harms or harms which occur within the home environment is probably much greater than the actual occurrence. But that doesn't mean that they're no less significant. So I'm just also thinking about fear of burglary as well, things like that. I mean, that's a great fear that people have, and people go to great lengths to secure their property and defend their space. And that's driven. I mean, you're the psychologist, Tom. You're the expert in this, not me. But I mean, that notion of fear, it seems to me, is one of those kind of existential kind of drivers. And I think that brings us all the way back kind of full circle to ideas about ontological security, doesn't it? And I think that one of the ideas about ontological security is a fear of a loss of control or a loss of identity or autonomy. So for me, I think that's the next thing, is thinking about housing and fear. So kind of watch this space, or listen to this space.
Thank you so much, Craig, for joining us today and for sharing your insights into the meaning of home and, the dark side of our homes and our houses, and thinking about the topics of social harm and social murder. Really want to wish you luck with your book and your papers, and we look forward to reading them in the future and having you back to discuss these when they're out as well. So thank you again for joining us today, Craig.
It's a pleasure, and thanks so much again. And thank you for collectively, with your listeners, holding me to account that I've got to deliver now, because I've said I'm doing it. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I'll look forward to listening to the rest of the series, because it's anything which makes us think long and hard about what it is about housing inequality, which generates health inequalities, is kind of long overdue and really, really important. So good luck with the rest of the series. Take care.
Cheers. Thank you, Craig.
Bye-bye.
So that is the end of this episode of Under One Roof. I hope you have found our conversation with Dr Craig Gurney thought-provoking and engaging. I'd like to thank Craig again for sharing his insights and expertise on the complex topic of home as a place of harm. As we wrap up this thought-provoking episode, we want to thank you, our amazing listeners, for joining us on this journey. We hope today's discussions have opened your eyes to the hidden realities of home and sparked curiosity for what lies ahead. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, where we'll continue to explore captivating topics that will leave you craving more. Thank you again for joining us on Under One Roof, and we can't wait to continue this conversation with you in the next episode.